Don't leave accessibility out of your SEO strategy with Billie Hyde from the SEO Works. Brought to you by Majestic, I'm David Bain and this is SEO in 2022. Billie, what's your number one SEO tip for 2022?
So my biggest tip for 2022 is to focus much more on accessibility. We've seen a lot recently of Google pushing page experience with Core Web Vitals and site speed, and it's all heading down a route of making the user experience better. And that includes accessibility. Google says in its mission statement, it wants the internet to be accessible by everyone, for everyone. So that means, as well as making sure we're having fast sites and it's available on people that for people that have like really weak 3G connections and things like that, we're also need to start thinking more about a wider range of users. So we want to think about users that are neurodiverse or are visually impaired, have limited mobility, have tremors and tics, like the people that only struggle with using our devices, and that this is going to be a massive thing over the coming years. I think, like, Google recently shared documents on having more inclusive language in the content that we share and how it likes that. Like, I think we're gone are the days where we just think about SEO as in creating content and making pages rank for neurotypical people. We want the internet to now be for everyone. And I think it's just going to keep going more that way.
So does making your website more inclusive actually give you a measurable positive impact in your SEO?
That is a really good question. It's a difficult one to answer. So there's around 20% of all the people on the planet have some sort of disability. So that's 20% of the world's population we could potentially be excluding from our sites. In 2020, there was an average of, I think it was around 60 billion sales made online. And 3% of all those sales were just made from people using screen readers. I think it's really, really hard to put a measurable way of tracking that because Google Analytics doesn't have the facilities available for us to see whether a screen reader is being used on Google Analytics. We don't know that because it's like private for the users, but it's still a lot of people. 3% of 60 billion. I can't do that kind of maths. I don't know anyone that can quickly do that without a calculator, but that's a lot of people. So whilst I can't put an exact metric or a measurable way of doing that, it's a massive way of increasing revenue for our clients. It's also just a common decency, really, making sites accessible. So I just think if it's something we targeted, we are much more likely to see an increase in traffic. Also, with users with disabilities, some studies have been done, which I can find and give you the resources for, where they are much more likely to become a returning user compared to a neurotypical person kind of thing. They're much more likely to return to a website that caters to their needs.
You've said that you can't really put figures on it, but you've certainly put lots of figures on it. And the one that jumped out for me is that you could be possibly excluding 20% of your audience by not being inclusion orientated to actually ensure that your website is accessible to everyone, and simply looking at from a commercial value of getting 20% more transactions on your website, then that's got a massive commercial value. There are many activities that SEOs do that they don't know definitively impact success, but they've got a hunch that it impacts success. And I think that if you're doing the right thing for the user, then search engines like Google will, if they're not doing so now, will catch up with that and reward you for doing so. Would you agree with those sentiments?
Absolutely. That's something I drone on about far too often. So every SEO knows that Google is now planning the mum update, and everything's being held really close to the chest. We don't really know much about it. The thing that really stuck to me when that update was announced was the video that they did where it was like, Google, can I wear these shoes to climb Mount Fuji? Like, how are they doing that? There's got to be something like a metric, or well, not a metric, like a tag or something that they're using there. And I am convinced that's alt text, sorry. So I think that's always the last thing. Every SEO I know does their alt text last on their optimization plans, but if they push that to be done sooner, the likelihood is, even if they're not actively thinking about accessibility, one, they're becoming more accessible, and two, they're probably going to help themselves in a year, 18 months, whenever Google decides to drop the mum bomb on sorry, I'm falling over my words. The mum bomb on us. Like, it's going to happen at some point.
I called it alt tags for years as well. It's very difficult to get out of a habit to move it. It's not a tag; it's a text. But it's easy to. It's difficult to change sometimes. Like conversations I've had about it's not Google My Business anymore. But that's a slight sidetrack there. How does an SEO get started with this? If they haven't done much work in the past about providing better accessibility for their users, there hasn't been any obvious work done by website designers in the past. What are the initial steps to take?
So, like with anything in SEO, I think a lot of the steps that you need to take are some self-learning. So the first thing I do literally anytime I need to learn something new is jump on learningseo.io from a lady created, and see what documentation's on there. And there's some fantastic people to also follow on Twitter. There's Lucy Pickering. There's another SEO called Diane. Her surname's just slipped my mind, and they are constantly dropping like knowledge bombs around accessibility. But I also think that there's a lot of doing it yourself to kind of learn things as well here, like even further. So what really got me into accessibility was the tool Sitebulb. They literally just added an accessibility option for their crawls, and that kind of got me learning. So I'd recommend using that. It's using the Axe DevTools like framework, and they provide you a lot of information on not what just issues are on the site, but also why these issues are important to people with various disabilities, and also how we could resolve them as well. There's so much reading that you can do on it, but a lot of the understanding and practical advice that I can give you is just start applying things and questioning why your clients might have done something one way, and if it's actually helpful for all the users that might need their site.
So what's driving this awareness and change? Is it government legislation, or is it simply the general public or website designers actually being more aware of a truer representation of their users?
It's a bit of everything, really. So in America, there's been some really big cases on accessibility and like excluding certain users from your sites, and that's there's like legislations in place there now. There's been a lot of publicity around that. But I think as the internet has grown and got larger and social media is connecting more and more people have a voice now, and we're more aware and connected to people and their pain points. Like we should listen to the people that are using our site, and if the people that are using our site are struggling to use it, we need to change things. So that affects everyone, really, from marketers, SEOs to the developers and user experience teams. We all really need to come together on this and make the internet a better place.
So how do you listen to people using your site? Are you talking about actually talking to people, or recording videos of actually people trying to get through something but not being able to get through something, or something else?
So for me, one of the things that originally got my attention with things like this to help me listen to the users is I used to work on a site for a client who are a big charity for people with autism. And I found that the pages that they'd created specifically for the people with like more severe levels of autism, that the bounce rate was high, that the users weren't actually connecting with the content. So you can look at bounce rate, you could do heat maps, there's various like triggers that we could do in Tag Manager to just see how a user actually relates to their site. But the best way to understand how someone uses their site is ask the users. So we were quite lucky there to be connected to their users and be able to just say, hey, how do you feel about this page? Like what how do you feel when you're using it? Does everything make sense? What do you want to do next? Do you actually want to read this page, kind of things? And from doing those things, we were able to just take on that advice, and some of it was really small things. It was like changing the text color just very slightly. So the text color wasn't actually being picked up by the various tools we were using as an accessibility issue. It was like a grey on a white background, so it stood out quite nicely.
Mm-hmm.
But for our specific target audience, they were struggling with that. So it was just a case of changing it and then results, really, kind of thing. Like you do. I think especially for people that are working with such specific niches, like people with learning difficulties or severe disabilities, that we really need to listen to them. We can also just check things ourselves as well. So it's really easy to just change the way you use a computer for like a little while. So instead of using your mouse, go on your website and try to tab across it like a user that might have limited mobility. But things like that will help so much for you just understanding there.
How does an SEO go about making those changes, or how often should changes be made? Is this something that can only really be affected by website redesign? So is it necessary to maybe just do this as part of a big website redesign project, or are these tweaks that need to be done on a regular basis?
They don't need to be done too regularly. Like you could do them once and then review in a year, 18 months kind of thing. But it also doesn't need to be a big website overhaul. Like you don't need to completely restructure the site. Making small changes can benefit massively. So that text change, that's depending on the CMS, of course. Like that could just be a really tiny change in the CMS and it'll change site-wide. It all depends on how hard you want to go on this. Again, it's one of those where it's really hard to say what the results of doing this are, but it's also massively beneficial as well. Like again, you could be increasing your audience by 20%, but you can't guarantee that. So it's a very hard sell.
So maybe use Sitebulb, maybe use a crawler, identify the potential biggest issues, and if it's not going to take too much work in terms of coding or website redevelopment, tweak them, get them improved, and see what kind of impact that has on different conversion rates and usability of your website. Billie, if an SEO is struggling for time and they think, absolutely, I need to be focusing on accessibility more here, what's one thing that they might be doing at the moment that's possibly more of a waste of time that they need to stop doing in order to spend more time focusing on accessibility in 2022?
This might be a controversial one because I know some people love a meta description. I personally don't love them that much. I find them boring to write and they're not always used. I'd recommend still writing meta descriptions, but maybe automate them to be a little bit more like, so you don't have to spend as much time on it, really. What you could do is in a spreadsheet with a bunch of if statements, create a few sentiments around the site and what you're trying to say, and just do something like that, pull it together quite quicker, and then you could save yourself, depending on the size of the site, hours and hours and hours of work, and you could just focus on something else while it's still getting done, but it's just not done to the same standard as manually writing them.
Great advice, because Google are often not taking the meta descriptions that you write anyway. So that's possibly a much better use of your time. Great advice. You can find Billie over at billiegina.co.uk. Billie, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2022.
Thank you so much.
Check out the rest of the content from SEO in 2022 over at seoin2022.com.